Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. As Westminster and the Senedd are now in recess for the summer, we are taking this opportunity to answer some of your questions. So with me on the pod this evening, we have Richard Mine. Hello, Richard.
Hello.
And we have Kerry Davis. Hello, Kerry.
Hello, boys.
Nanda. So we'll start off with a listener question. Rich, as we go into the summer, which national government is in the best shape?
If you look at the situation across the United Kingdom right now, which government is succeeding politically at the moment, or which government's political project is clearly in the ascendancy, I would have to say the only one that comes to mind is the Welsh Government. They have been bolstered by a very strong election support. And I think you look at the comparative, and everything is comparative, everything is relative, the comparative swagger with which they are proceeding with their programme for government. And I think that they are looking in a really good position. In Westminster, it seems to me, and I'd be curious to know what you think about this, Matt, it seems to me that we have already crossed the point at which the UK government has started to lose its credibility with the public. But we haven't hit the point at which that is showing in the polls yet. But I think when we look back historically, the start of this year will be the time when Boris, it's clear that public trust in the Johnson administration started to erode. So what do you think?
I really don't have much to say on this. I don't really understand the question. Three governments are in very comfortable situations. If there was an election tomorrow, all three would be re-elected. I really don't think there's any danger for any of them. They're all doing, in political terms, which is their ability to win elections, all doing absolutely fine. Their ability to govern, as you've mentioned with regards to the UK government, yeah, perhaps that is in question. In real political terms, they'd all be absolutely fine tomorrow.
I'm just gonna come in on that and concur with Matt completely. It's exactly what I was going to say. You've got Wales, Labour sitting pretty, just got one of the best election results. SNP, Scotland, building towards that kind of second referendum. And although, the news is full of what's going wrong in Westminster, they are sitting pretty. The polls are still showing that they would win if they had another election. And where we are at the summer, all three administrations are sitting pretty.
So you talk about Scotland there, Rich. Do you agree with Liz Truss and Douglas Ross when they say that the Conservatives are going to win the next Holyrood election?
I mean, the chance of me agreeing with either of those two people on anything at the best of times is pretty slim. The idea that the Conservatives are going to win any more seats than they have now in any future election in Scotland just seems utterly bonkers. You're quite right that the three governments in the three nations on Britain would all win tomorrow. But what about trajectories, though? I mean, I just that there is a sort of sense of the project starting, the wheel starting to come off the bus made out of an old wine crate. If I can dig into the Johnson back catalogue of terrible press gaffes. In a year's time, when we join the dots backwards, I think that there's just something, you can just see the way that the various fights that the UK government has picked right now are starting to leave, the Teflon has worn off, and it's been in the oven too many times, and now you've got those ghosts of meals past baked onto it, and there's like a Hancock shape burnt onto the plate. There's the singe on the end where they've lost the flame war with the English football team. It's absolutely starting to take the sheen off them. However, ultimately, politically, 100% correct, there is not a strong opposition in Westminster, so they would win in England again tomorrow. But yes, I think you're large. Yeah, I agree with you. I hate agreeing completely with my colleagues all the time because it's not great radio. But
well, I'll throw you both a curveball at the end, because you both recently did a pod about Northern Ireland, and we do have listeners in Northern Ireland. So either of you got a take on that particular administration, where we are in Northern Ireland, you want to put out?
I mean, I'd be shocked if it goes the distance till next year. And I think that when that election does happen, I think you are very likely to see the first ever Sinn Féin First Minister of Northern Ireland. I think that's the general trajectory. We were talking to Thomas Leahy.
We've been talking about no change in any of the rest part of, and you just dropped that one in at the last. That is really big kind of thing to say. How have we talked about Scotland, England, and Wales and said, no, nothing's happening for so long, and then Northern Ireland, you come up with that? Tell us a little bit more about that, Matt.
If you look at all the unionist support, so for a very long time, for as long as I can really recall anyway, the DUP have been the largest party, and the Assembly has had a unionist majority. In the last Assembly election, they lost that unionist majority, but the DUP was still by one seat the largest party. Now, as you see unionist support fracture, with lots of people starting to say they'll support traditional unionist voice, which is an even more right-wing unionist party, and a few people going back to the UUP, the more moderate unionist party. You actually see a point where, like Thomas was saying to us last week, where in some polls, the DUP are joint second, joint third with the Alliance Party. There's no guarantee, although it's very likely with transfers, etc., that they would end up as the second party at least. Yeah, I think it's inevitable, really, that you'll have Sinn Féin as the largest party, especially if the polls hang course as they are doing right now. I don't see any other result, really, unless, because of the way their STV system works, smaller unionist parties get eliminated and the DUP win enough support to be the largest party again, or the polls tighten because of the squeeze when unionist voters decide they're going to back the DUP to stop Sinn Féin winning. But otherwise, I think it's pretty inevitable. Would you agree, Rich?
100%. I think all of the drama around Northern Ireland of recent has been to do with the UK government's mishandling of Brexit and the negotiations about the Northern Ireland seaboard, or the Brexit border in the Irish Sea. I hate to be not positive about the future of Northern Ireland, but I think we're on the cusp of a very, very, very difficult time. If the situation that Matt paints a picture of there does come true, and we do see a nationalist First Minister, the safety that the unionist community has always felt will start to evaporate, and they will react to the sensation that Northern Ireland is drifting towards unification. It's not beyond possibility that you could have a Sinn Féin government both north and south of the border, and it's not like they will be shy about putting forward a reunification agenda. And then you'll see, instead of the kind of political fireworks, you might actually see real fireworks once again. And I think that's something we all need to be prepared for. And also, it's incredibly difficult to even think about this, but you would really hope that the grown-ups start behaving like grown-ups in Westminster, and start deal with the reality of the situation on the ground, instead of prodding the fire with their ridiculous agenda with regards to undoing the protocol that they signed just a couple of years ago.
If you want to hear more on that, of course, please go back and listen to our wonderful episode with Thomas Leahy, who's very interesting, about Northern Ireland. Kerry, I think you had a question.
Brexit is key to all of this, and Rich just touched on about there. So, where are we with Brexit in Northern Ireland? I know you two follow this quite closely. How is Brexit looking for you two, both Northern Ireland, but also the stories in the papers this week about the shelves being empty and things like that? Where's Brexit for you now?
Go on, Matt. You've been glued to the parliamentary committees.
Brexit is becoming a very noticeable problem, the trade issues. And I think that if you had a party that was in opposition in Westminster, who was able to draw attention to these issues, then I think there may be some political capital in it. But it does appear as though the UK Labour Party have decided to accept Brexit is done, which it is really. It's obviously not the consequences of it, that we'll live with those for a very long time. But I think they don't really want to make a big deal about Brexit, because if they do, then the Conservative Party can send out targeted ads to all the quote-unquote red wall constituencies saying, look at the Labour Party still not over Brexit. And I think that they are sort of paralysed by the fear of that happening, so they don't really want to bring it up too much. similar to what happened with Jeremy Corbyn when we didn't really have a massively clear policy on Brexit. We just sort of avoided it because it was difficult. And I think that's probably what the UK Labour Party will do again until it becomes such a big political issue that it's unavoidable. But even then, the Conservatives will just say, well, you backed this deal.
Keir Starmer isn't really, making a huge position in opposition on any of the big ticket items. Is that the reason with Brexit?
Considering the Labour Party's position on Brexit is because we lost so badly in 2019, and one of the major factors behind that was because people wanted to get Brexit done. In a lot of our constituencies, they voted for the Conservative Party to do that. So that, I think, is a major reason. I think that Keir believes that one of the best ways to reconnect with former Labour voters who voted Conservative in 2019 is just to accept the fact that Brexit is done. With regards to Keir's overall performance, I mean, me and Rich have talked about this a bit, but you think he's doing better. He has been ever so slightly better, I think, at PMQs, but, William Hague used to win PMQs all the time, and you see what that happened with him in a general election. So a slightly better PMQs does not a Prime Minister in waiting make. If you look at the state of the party overall, well highlighted this week the financial difficulties that the party is in. They're behind in the polls. They lack a persuasive narrative that seems to be connecting with large groups of people. This is all before, of course, the boundary changes come in, which will take away a huge amount of inbuilt Labour advantage in Westminster elections. At the minute, it looks like if they win the next general election, it will be as a consequence of Conservative mistakes rather than any Labour inspiration at a Westminster level. And I even if that happens, I still think it's a big, long shot for Labour to win the next election. I just don't think Keir is really connecting with people. I think that I heard a very interesting argument, one that I'm not massively sure I agree with particularly, but it's an interesting line to put forward, which is under Keir Starmer, Labour have the complete opposite problem that they had under Jeremy Corbyn, which is under Corbyn, they had huge cut through. People just weren't overly keen on what they heard. But under Keir, they have no cut through at all. And I'm not sure if that's accurate, but I think it's at least an interesting argument to put forward. And I think people just aren't listening. I think it's dreadfully hard during a pandemic anyway to get people to listen to you, because the only politics they really want to listen to is the Prime Minister deciding whether you can go to the pub with your mates or not. There are so many things Keir could talk about. He was very good, I thought, when England were doing well in the football, to garner a sense of national pride in England. I just feel like the cut through isn't there. And the only thing he's done this week was criticise the UK government for their 3% pay rise, even though the Welsh Labour government have agreed to do the exact same thing.
Yeah, I wonder with Keir Starmer, what is the ceiling for success for Keir Starmer? And what the Labour Party sees as success is winning elections, and everything else is not success.
Yep.
A part of me just thinks the point with Starmer is he's a night watchman in the cricketing sense. His job, his success for the Keir Starmer administration would be to stop the rot and to keep the ship relatively steady so that the more interesting, exciting batsman can come on and hopefully score some runs the following day. And I think you talk about him in the context of William Hague, and I think he's very similar. He's obviously less interesting, less funny, but I do think he is starting to, his new team that have been in post for a few weeks now have started to give him the tools and maybe just let him take a few more risks in terms of things. And I think, the Starmer who took over the Labour Party would not have stooped so low as to use a cheap political line like the Johnson variant to talk about a variant of the COVID virus, because it is a bit cheap. But that's the kind of thing that sticks. See in dictionary Captain Hindsight, which is infantile, puerile, but it cuts through. I do not think we have more than a 1 in a million chance of seeing Prime Minister Keir Starmer. I just don't think it's going to happen. But if he can, arrest the decline of the Labour Party in England and maybe try and start planting the seeds of what will come next. I think there's a possibility, that people could look back on his reign as the Labour leader with, as the kind of beginnings, like the green shoots. But I just don't think it's going to be more than that. Like you say, there's just structural problems as well as political problems. There's just structural problems until either the ruling party in England completely collapses and does something stupid, which is always possible. The thing that I'm missing with the Labour Party right now is the supporting cast. I mean, we talk about Keir Starmer being anonymous, but who are the supporting cast of frontbenchers in the Labour Party in London at the moment? I mean, they're anonymous, and whether that's by design or by accident, it's just not going to work. If you can't even, I mean, all of the focus groups. So listen, as you do, Matt, I know to the focus groups that Matt Chorley does with the Times Red Box, and they can barely name Keir Starmer, who is the leader of the Labour Party in England. What chance do they have of naming Rachel Reeves or Nick Thomas-Symonds or these various people that just have zero public profile? And you can't win an election like that. You just can't.
No. William Hague in 2001 had total seat gain of 1. So, I hope he does better than that. I think the hope for a lot of people is he's more of a Kinnock, is that he gets Labour back to a position where we could win an election rather than necessarily actually winning one. The Johnson variant, I had to look this up because I thought it was interesting, is what Armando Iannucci thought of the Johnson variant. Obviously, everyone who knows Armando Iannucci, the writer of The Thick of It, among many other things. But he said, I see what you're getting at calling it the Johnson variant, but it sounds cheap, Trump-light, and childish. And I sort of agree with him, to be honest. The best bit of political comms they've done in the last few weeks was when the Conservative MP Lee Anderson said he was not going to watch any of the England games, and they found out that he was born in 1967. So they said that, obviously, the last time that England won an international tournament was 1966. And they said that, well, we think that he's been the jinx all along. So we ask him to stop watching the game until the final. And that's the best political comms they've done, I think, in the last few weeks. But everything else is just a bit same old,
Starmer can't be someone that he isn't. He is a slightly boring, middle-aged, middle-class dad. If the Labour Party wanted someone who was going to electrify the public discourse in the UK, they would have elected somebody else. He is not the man for that. Think of him as a Kinnock, but the thing that Kinnock had was oratory. And Starmer doesn't have that in any way, shape or form. When it came for Kinnock to, kind of fight those internal battles publicly, he could do it in a way that he could bring people with him. And that's, at the end of the day, that's what Starmer lacks more than anything else in the world, which is there are people that back him because they know he's a generally good person, generally good centre-left compass that most people in the Labour Party will like. But he's not going to bring people to the Labour Party because he's just not that person. But then you look around him and you think, well, who is going to fulfil that role? And like I said, I mean, there's no one else on the front bench that can do that either. And you look back, I was looking back because of all the stuff that's come out about the 1997 records being released. I was looking back at some old videos of Tony Blair speaking. Now, there is a person who history is not treating kindly. But you look back at the way that he spoke not only to his party members, but also to the wider public in the run-up to 1997. And he really sold his vision of the future. And he had Gordon Brown, he had John Prescott, Robin Cook. He had all these people that had their constituencies that could bring voters with them. If I was, in the Labour Party now, you'd be looking at the PLP and seeing where are those people who have a genuine vision for the future, who can really sell that vision. Is it just a bit dull and managerial? Which works in Wales when you're in government and you've got 20 years of history and you can rely on your electoral machine to get the voters out for you. You can be a little bit dull, but you're going to be locked into opposition for years unless you can find a way of really exciting the electorate. I don't think anyone genuinely believes he's going to win an election. So why would people be disappointed that he isn't?
Well, all right. Kerry, what is your opinion on the Labour leader? The Labour leader.
So good they named him twice.
No, I was trying to do a really bad Kinnock impression.
Okay.
Who is the Labour leader these days? No, I'm only joking. I actually thought Keir was a good choice when he was elected, but I'm not familiar enough with the Labour Party to know how he is viewed internally. But I thought someone with his record, his position, I thought he was an eminently sensible choice. But, you know, you mentioned cut through earlier, Matt, and Labour just isn't in my media kind of readings, and I'm not sure if it is in many people's, but is that deliberate? Is that just the state of our media, who they want to focus on the issues? Or is it a deliberate Labour Party position just to, you know, lie low and wait for the opposition to drop the ball? Because, you know, if we're honest, we must be expecting them to drop the ball relatively soon.
Yeah, I think it's. I heard someone say it the other day, and I really can't remember who it was. But the impression you get is that Keir Starmer would make a really good prime minister, but isn't a fantastic leader of the opposition. Whereas Boris Johnson would make an amazing leader of the opposition, but doesn't make that good a prime minister. And I think that's the problem you've got, is that one is a natural campaigner. And you see that in the way the UK government operate. They are constantly on the campaign. They're constantly thinking about winning the next election.
So one of the key things that is this week, and I think we've got to focus on, is let's take a leaf out of O's Will's book and state that Wales isn't England, and bring our discussions back to Wales. So have we got any letters or questions about where we are, Matt, or do you want me to pick
Absolutely, Kerry. There was a really good one, actually. And I'll ask our Plaid Cymru voice this one first. Should Plaid Cymru take a more reserved approach to campaigning for independence? Mr. Mine?
My God, so much pressure. The idea of being a voice for Plaid Cymru is quite extraordinary. It's already happened, hasn't it? I mean, that's, it hasn't been talked about in the same tones since the election. I think it's almost inevitable that it won't be the focus of Plaid Cymru's energies in the near future. But I do think that one thing has changed in Plaid Cymru, which is, I think, that shift from talking about full national status to independence. You know, that point at which it was they were almost shy about talking about it. I think that has now changed for good. I think it's a little bit of a shame, actually, that their Independence Commission work that they did, which was not really an independence commission, as we well know, it was a confederalism commission. It feels disappointing to me that work hasn't continued in the same way and finding space to exist or to coexist with the work that Mick Antoniv is leading on behalf of the Welsh Government, because actually, as we've talked about before, the difference between Plaid Cymru's independence as confederalism and Labour Party's unionism as confederalism is really not that far apart. Based on everything that I've seen and heard over the last couple of months, that the period of reflection and introspection on behalf of Plaid Cymru about what went right and what went wrong in that campaign means that the foregrounding of independence as the key campaign plank, as it was during the campaign, will disappear quite quickly. And actually, I suspect that's not just Plaid Cymru, but all of the independent supporting parties will probably do the same. What do you think, Kerry?
Yeah, I agree with you, Rich. I'm not sure where Plaid are on it. I'm not going to be their spokesperson. I'm not even going to talk on the Greens. I think for both parties, the focus is very much on next year's local elections as soon as the summer's over. I think we've discussed on the pod before, and certainly that's something I believe is, to win political success, it's at the grassroots level, it's at community and then council level. And I think Plaid will definitely be looking at that. I don't think the independent argument is going to be a big player at local government level. It's going to be different issues. And so for the next year, that's what we're going to be looking at. And independence will still be there. We'll have polls from various things and people can bemoan the polls. But it's not going to be a driving force. It's not going to be on the big political agenda in Wales, I think, until we head up towards, dare I say it, the next election. But it's far too far ahead.
Yeah, on the independence point, I think everyone agrees with you, don't they? That Plaid approached the election incorrectly. They approached an election which was going to be about healthcare and the economy with a constitutional focus to try and win over Labour voters who support independence. And even though they did that, over 40% of people who support independence voted for Labour. I don't think that means they have to ignore independence, though. I don't think that campaign is over at all. I think, actually, if you look at the election results, it shows that there is a really strong majority in favour of more powers and more self-determination for Wales, even if it isn't necessarily independence. But Plaid, I think, do need, if they are ever to form a government or to break into the situation where they can be the largest party of government, they do need to find a strategy. And going back to talking about Sinn Féin, like we did earlier, Kerry, I think that the best model that Plaid can follow if they ever want to win over Labour supporters is not appeal to their desire for independence, but to appeal for their radicalism and their socialism, and to follow the Sinn Féin model in the Irish election, where they focused very heavily on housing and healthcare, but are not hiding the fact that they also support Irish reunification. I think we've talked about this for over a year now, and I think if that is what Plaid had done in the Senate election just gone, they may have done better. But you never know, because I think a lot of people were going to back Drakeford no matter what.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this Sinn Féin analogy quite a lot, because we talked a lot about that during the election period. And the more I think about it, the more I fall on the side that you just described, Matt, where I think there was nothing really that they could do on that social justice side. They were never going to out-Labour the idea of the Labour Party, not necessarily the actions of the Labour Party in government in Wales, but the success of Sinn Féin pursuing that kind of policy platform was in opposition to Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, neither of which fill the same spot as the Labour Party on the political spectrum. They're much more to the right, and so there was more oxygen there for Sinn Féin to take up and to use. Those conditions are just not there in Wales, and I think there's a ceiling on the vote in the south, in the former industrial heartlands, that we've all known about for a long time. But I think what the result this year proved more than anything is how tough that ceiling is, how hard it is, how difficult it will be for Plaid to break through based on their, I think, post-2011 strategy, which is to target the South East Wales heartlands. And I think you will see inevitably, particularly given the strong showings in second places in rural Wales, you'll see the growing prominence of those other constituencies outside the southeast to the party in terms of winning constituency seats. That's where the opportunity really lies. But the local elections, as Kerry said, actually will be with us in next to no time. And you only have to look at in the Plaid Cymru heartlands of the Fro Gymraeg, they're already essentially out campaigning hard on that, based on the second homes issue that we touched on earlier. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what those issues are elsewhere. I'd be surprised if we see that much distance between the objectives of Plaid Cymru and Labour in government in the foreseeable future, because I think the continuing encroachment on devolution by the UK government is actually going to force them together. Possibly also Jane Dodds as the Liberal Democrat, she may vote with them as a bloc. But as they try and sort of bulwark the devolution settlement, or even grow the devolution settlement in the face of aggressive anti-devolutionism from Westminster, I think we'll see maybe the stridency of those debates maybe subside a little bit and be replaced by a little bit more constructive collaboration.
Should we move on to, I think, one of my favourite questions we got this week, which was actually sent to you, wasn't it, Rich? Which was relating to the 97 disclosures that you mentioned earlier. And this came from a friend of the podcast, Dr. Martin Johns,
Professor Martin Johns.
Professor Martin Johns. He said that, according to the 97 disclosures, Ron Davies pushed hard for the idea of Swansea being the home of the Welsh Parliament. So, and he asked, what do we think Wales would be like if it had gone to Swansea? Kerry?
Yeah, back at the time, I remember the discussions around Swansea getting the Senate. It would have been something I wasn't totally averse to. I like the idea of having different cities that have certain kind of sector responsibilities like you see elsewhere. You know, Australia's got Canberra as the political capital, Sydney, Melbourne as economic drivers. So I would have quite happily seen Swansea or somewhere else as the political capital for Wales, and Cardiff as the economic driver, as it may well have continued to be back at the time. But you know, this is all in the distant past. It was really interesting what came out in some of the notes. But I would have quite happily seen Swansea as the location of the Senedd.
Well, I was 6 when the devolution referendum happened, Kerry, so I don't recall the conversations as thoroughly as you do. But I agree with you. I think that a lot of people have talked about the idea of different capitals for different things in Wales, and I'm fully supportive of that. I think that's the best way you can see growth in other regions of Wales, and I think even though it was rejected at the time, I can't see it being much of a strong argument against really seeing things move out of Cardiff. Rich?
Well, it's interesting if you look at the actual documents that are involved here. It was sort of mostly prompted by the fact that Cardiff was trying to charge too much for the use of City Hall. So, you know, Cardiff's greed pushing the National Assembly to Swansea would have been a very classic Cardiff move from a planning point of view, wouldn't it? Sceptical about the idea of the National Assembly having been relocated anywhere other than Cardiff ultimately, because the world has a variety of countries where the parliament is located away from the major conurbations, and those places where the parliament ultimately ends up being located end up being pretty unspectacular. Now, I'm losing listeners in Swansea every second I talk about this, so I've got to be super careful. Cardiff was the obvious choice. And I'm not sure that other alternatives were that serious ultimately in terms of consideration.
Do you not think we should have the metropolis of Machynlleth? You know, a brand new city forged in mid Wales to have the seat of Welsh power?
Equidistant from Carnarvon to Cardiff, yeah, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, like Stay Little, or that would have been very geographically satisfying. But I think you cannot resist the fact that Cardiff, at the time that the Parliament, the Senedd was being built, Cardiff was the only city, I think, maybe, or Swansea had only recently become a city. No, when did Swansea become a city?
It was a few while
furious ago. Swansea listeners shouting the date. No, I don't know.
I only know it because it was referred to in Twin Town. The difference between the triangle flags and the square flags on the corner posts. Is that something like that?
Isn't that the FA Cup win, actually, Rich, rather than
1969. It became a city. 1969. Thanks to
our
friends at Google.
I think you're thinking of Newport. Newport is a relatively new city, Rich. You've got to remember Cardiff voted no for devolution, and Swansea voted yes. So I think, despite what Richard said, I think that's a pretty strong case. There's an aspect where you want to give it to an area that wanted it, and I do think, certainly to avoid some of the criticisms which are creeping into Wales now, and which we see in other parts of the world, you know, it is an imbalanced country with the southeast having an awful lot, and the Senedd is for devolution has been a big economic driver, I think, for Cardiff, and wherever it had been placed, I think it would have been an economic driver, and it would have been a useful tool to have a bit of rebalancing in that regard. But Cardiff is the capital. It was always going to be favourite. But I don't think Swansea was too far off the mix, despite what various civil servants put to Tony Blair at the time.
Rich, the part 2 of that question was also very interesting, which is, what would Wales be like now if Ron Davies had become First Minister? Did you have any thoughts on that?
One of the great what-ifs of devolution, isn't it? Because, you think about it, in the short term, what would have happened? I think it's very clear that the first few years of Welsh devolution would have been far less rocky. They would have been far more energised. But if we hadn't had Alan Michael, would we then not have had Rhodri Morgan? And without Rhodri Morgan, would we not have had the One Wales Agreement, which then pushed us into primary lawmaking powers? And so I think it's possible we might have seen a bit more stagnation. Actually, I think there was almost a sense of creative self-destruction about that period when Alan Michael was first secretary, that kind of catalysed the subsequent development of the Senedd. What do you think, Matt? I mean,
you were about 8.
You were coming to the end of primary school at this point, so you must have been really, kind of a keen observer of the times.
What was the year? 99. I was.
Oh, come on.
7. Alan Michael and his attitude towards coalition building, which I appreciate, is not something that a lot of Labour people are particularly fond of, generally. Nearly sank the Senedd before it even started. We'll never know, really, whether Ron Davies would have been sensible enough to form a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. I do think that Rhodri Morgan would have always ended up First Minister, though. Really? I think that was inevitable, yeah. Force of nature. I think that whether he would have the reputation he does now, again, we'll never know, because I think a lot of the reputation that Rhodri has is as a consequence of his ability to steady the ship and to make it go from strength to strength. He wasn't an amazing election winner, necessarily. He was, in 2007, we had our lowest ever score. It's the reason we had to form the One Wales Agreement. But he was an amazing governor of Wales, and he kept it on its feet.
I think we've got to move on from the what ifs and things, gents, because that 2007 election could open up the biggest what if about the Rainbow Coalition and where Wales would be. But I, for one, would have liked to have seen Ron Davies as a First Minister, and where that would have gone. That is a big what if, and one we can talk about at length.
Yeah, can I just float this while we're talking about this stuff from 97? I think it's really interesting to see some of that stuff in black and white that we've talked about for years. I mean, it's been public knowledge for years quite how dismissive the UK government was about the status of the Welsh Assembly, certainly when held up against the Scottish Parliament. But what did you read into the proposal for a royal snub of the Welsh Assembly in 99, particularly in light of the recent polling on behalf of the Western Mail that shows what a deeply pro-monarchy country Wales is?
Polls seem to be a thing in Wales, don't they? But people like them if they say what you want, and they disagree with them if they say what you don't. I thought Martin Shipton was really good this week when he chastised people criticising the Prince William poll, but quite happily to laud the independence polls from the same publication. But I'm one of the people, I'm firmly in a Republican camp, and I found that poll quite disappointing on a number of levels. It's a Wales that just doesn't resonate with me. I've got quite a lot of family who are royalist and things, but it's just not apparent in my life, and I'm surprised that Wales is so, from that poll, there's no reason to doubt it, so heavily wedded to the idea of the continuation of the royal family and that kind of archaic investiture procedure. So quite disappointing, really.
Carwyn Jones said that, didn't he? I think he said something along the lines of, I could envisage an independent Welsh state, but I think you'd have a much harder job having a Welsh republic. I think he's probably right. I think even if you look at the independence campaigns in Scotland, they still wanted to keep the Queen as the head of state. Republicans have to sort of accept that it's probably not going to be in our favour for some time.
Is it a
I
case
think
of
the Queen is just so popular in general. She's viewed by a lot of people as a figure of strength, and most people have lived with her as the only monarch they've ever known in Britain, and I think that she's seen as part of the state, part of the very nature of the place. and I think it also helps. This is 94-year-old great grandmother. I don't think people have much desire to kick her out of her house, but I think that may change with different generations. But with the popularity of people like Liam and his kids, I don't really see it being a much of a campaign.
The thing that disappoints me on it, and for me, it's wider than just the royal family and the investiture and Prince William, whether you like them or not. It's the principles behind it. It's around the hereditary aspect of it, and that's just not in our royal family. We've still got an element of government which is managed or has an element of hereditary peerage in that, and these are really quite, for me, wide principles on what kind of state we want to be, and that kind of idea of hereditary privilege and that kind of role in office in the state is just total anathema, and it shouldn't just be looked at, this would be a lovely occasion. And I think we've got some high profile Welsh nationalists who are all for the occasion and what it will bring, and I can understand that, but it does trickle down into some really fundamental principles about the society we want, how we're governed. And that's what I find disappointing. For me, although it's not being asked, it's an indicative support for that aspect, like that hereditary aspect of the Lords is a confirmation from that poll in a very tenuous link, but that's what I make from it.
Yeah, very quickly, just to kind of follow up the stuff from 97 as well. I mean, one of the things that's quite telling about that release of paperwork that came out was the list of things that the Blair government prioritised and the list of things that were on its to-do list that it left until, it kind of put on the back burner. What was really surprising to me reading through it was how much they were talking about English devolution. Throughout that whole document, or through that whole raft of documents that were published. But because they didn't choose to do anything about it as their top priority when they came into office in 97, then ultimately, there is a window for any government to get something major done within your first couple of years. They prioritised Wales and Scotland. The list of things that were on their back burner list were English devolution, PR for European elections, and PR for Westminster elections. And I think it's quite telling now that where are we? Here we are 25 years later. You think about what may have been transformational for the United Kingdom. Wouldn't it be interesting if instead of prioritising Welsh and Scottish devolution, they'd managed to prioritise PR for Westminster elections after 1997? Imagine how different the United Kingdom would be if there was genuine PR like STV or Westminster. That would have been a really interesting alternate United Kingdom.
Can't help but agree with you, Rich. I think we've had a few guests on have said really that what Labour should have done in 97, I think it's Kevin David and Darryl Lee Worthy have both come on and said really they should have just prioritised PR, and actually we should prioritise PR now before we do any more constitutional change. We should just focus on sorting the electoral system out. Something that Kevin David is again actually pushing very, very heavily at the moment. All power to them. We have a couple more questions. Which one do you want to do? Do you want to do Alistan, or do you want to just move on to predictions?
Tell us a little bit about Alistan Morgan.
Alistan. Well, obviously we paid tribute a little bit after one of our previous episodes to Alistan. A bit of a political hero of mine, absolute giant of the Welsh Labour movement. Without him and his campaigning, I don't think we'd have the Senedd, really. He sacrificed his opportunity to go back into Parliament, really, to run the Yes for Wales campaign in 79. And I know that he's been a huge and very important influence on many members of the modern Welsh Labour Party and pretty much every member of Labour for Independent Wales. And I think that his suggestion that he had a few years ago of Dominion status for Wales, although it sounded a bit out there 5 years ago, is now taken more and more seriously. And, as we always like to do on this pod, is to tell everybody about really interesting other bits of Welsh media. Martin Shifton did a fantastic podcast with us a couple of years ago, which I think I will recommend to absolutely everybody to go and listen to, because the man was incredible, funny, charming. hugely intelligent and a massive, massive loss to Welsh politics.
Yeah, we'll put a link to that podcast in the show notes. It seems to me that what did seem quite a wacky idea, the idea of Dominion status, it sounds like something from another era, but it is coherent, and you can see it very much in the thinking of Carwyn Jones and the way that he's looking to position Wales in the UK context in the future. So yes, completely echo your words there.
I only knew him relatively recently, but was aware of his role in the Devolution campaign in the 70s. But what I was struck by in one of the obituaries I read, that he was actually quite important and implied at the start of his political career, which threw me. When I read Matt, I don't know why he went from Plaid. I think he was due to succeed Gwynfor Evans as president, but then he was a Labour Party member and candidate. Why was that?
I think it was his belief that Plaid were not going to win elections, and he thought that the best way to change Wales was to be part of the Labour Party. And I know people make that decision absolutely every day. Who am I to say whether they are right or wrong? That I think that a lot of progressives in Wales have always felt that way. The best way to change Wales is through the Labour Party, and I think that Ellis Dan felt much the same.
I don't think it fundamentally represented a change in his values, did it, man?
No, I don't think so.
Sorry, chap. That I was just the Welsh historian in me. I'll chase up Martin Johns a little bit later.
We should probably end with a bit of a look forward then, shouldn't we? Kerry, what are your predictions for this summer and for when the Senedd and Westminster return in September?
Well, I haven't really got much further forward than the Lion series, to be honest, Matt. And I don't want to start that argument with Rich again. In terms of the summer, I think it's going to be a long, hot summer. But we can take the circle back to our opening of the pod on where the governments are. I can't see anything really upsetting any of the apple carts. I think that the big ticket items we've discussed tonight and in previous pods will continue. And it's just going to be, people will be having a quiet summer, seeing where the pandemic takes us. That is still something we haven't talked about tonight, but it is the overriding driver of all things in all nations at the moment, rightly so. And we'll see where we are post-summer with that, and whether we are moving back towards normal or whether the variants and the pandemic continues both across the world and in the UK.
Over to you, Matt. What do you think? Are you feeling positive or negative about the future of the country over the summer?
I don't think we'll see a huge amount of change, to be perfectly honest. I think that the Bay is forming quite a nice majority consensus, really, as you said, between Labour and Plaid. I think they basically agree on pretty much everything. So I think that in terms of how they approach coronavirus specifically, I think there's not going to be a huge amount of disagreement. I think they'll end up in a situation where Plaid try and create the impression they oppose the government, but they broadly agree with the government, whereas the Conservative Party broadly disagree with the Welsh government and try and make them follow a model which is more for nation approach. I think that the one big thing, and I agree with Kerry, it will be coronavirus related, it is now this problem with waiting lists. The statistic that came out a few days ago, which showed that something like 19% of the Welsh population is on a waiting list of some kind. I think that situation is only going to get worse without serious investment and focus. And I think that's a massive, massive test for the new health minister, Lynedd Morgan. So I think that is the one thing to really, really keep an eye on in the first few months of the Senedd term. What about you, Rich?
I agree. I think domestic politics within Wales looks pretty settled, and the Welsh Government is going to plough its own steady furrow with, I think with plenty of scope there to collaborate with parties. Not just, I think I've been pleasantly surprised by how many of the new Conservative intake have been willing to engage in very constructive ways with an awful lot of the Sened's work in a way that, we really do feel that some of those poisonous elements that came from the previous Senedd, that's really been flushed away now, and we are looking at a much more constructive Senedd. The one thing that I would say is that I'm really worried about the pandemic. I think that particularly across the border in England, I think the sharp relaxation in regulations and the kind of slightly more febrile debates about civil liberties and responsibilities is going to create a lot of problems. And we're already seeing, the numbers of cases of coronavirus across the border are skyrocketing right now. And I wonder for how long the Welsh Government can maintain its slightly more successful management of the pandemic in Wales. But looking forward to September, I think one of the interesting things we're going to see more of is what happens when the UK government legislates more in terms of trade, in terms of environmental policy, in terms of food policy, in ways that cross-cut across the devolveds. We're not going to see harmonious relationship coming out of that. And what happens when that happens? I think that's going to be the big challenge. Obviously, COVID aside, which is the biggest challenge. But I think the big challenge coming forward is what happens when the aggressive United Kingdom government anti-devolutionary stuff really kind of starts pushing forward. And I hope that the discourse that we have within Wales at that time is better than whose flag is bigger than whose, because that's ultimately just a massive distraction.
And on that cheery flag-related note,
to be honest with you, I found out today that the flag for Breconshire is a yellow background with a great big blue bat. So
I saw that.
That's going to be the biggest flag going soon.
I have a guy who lives by me who has a massive flagpole and will fly a variation of the Drycoch, the flag of Glyndŵr, the Prince of Wales standard, the Union flag, and a big yellow smiley face. And I really want to talk to him because I really want to know what motivates those individual flag choices. Thank you both for chatting inane rubbish with me for as long as we have. If people want to find you on Twitter, Rich, where can they find you?
At Benmosa Cymru, discourse mostly chirpier than it has been this evening.
Kerry?
I'm still Kerry the Viking.
And I am Hexter101, HEXTER101. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard tonight on Hiraeth, please do not forget to find us on Medium at Hiraeth Blog Cymru, on Facebook at Hiraeth Blog Cymru, and on Twitter at Hiraeth Blog. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.